Okay, good morning. It is just after 8 o'clock in Boulder, and I think it's about time to get going. We're going to have a very full program today, and this session will probably be very full too. I'm Robert Linds. I'm the Associate Director and Head of Public Services here at the University of Colorado Law Library, and I'm very, very pleased to offer this program to you. This is something I've wanted to do for some time, to have us reach out to all the public librarians and offer some assistance in how to do research. So we have, of course, the audience here, but we also have a webinar audience that is connecting. So welcome to all of you out there across the state of Colorado, and thank you for joining us. So what the program will be is I'll talk for to about 8:30 and introduce the legal system and legal authority, and we'll talk a little bit about dealing with legal patrons with legal reference questions. Then I'll turn this over to Karina from University of Denver Law School, talk about statutes, and then Scott Ewell, who is our current law library fellow, and he'll talk about the Colorado judiciary and researching case law. And then Mark Popolarski from DU will come to talk about regulations. Our own Mike Martinez from St. Mary's in Texas will talk about federal law, and Margie Heinen, a law firm librarian, will talk about local government law. Then we'll wrap it up around 11:30. And for y'all who are here at the end of the session today, if you'd like to have a tour of the law library, I'd be happy to do that and show some of the resources that we'll be talking about. In terms of questions, for you folks on the webinar, there's a Q&A option that will prompt me with a question. I'll do the best I can to answer it for you. And of course, you all in the room, just raise your hand and I'll do what I can to answer your questions. So feel free to ask questions at any time and make this as relevant as I can for you all. All right, let me move on then to the first slide. Okay, so this is the introduction to legal system and legal authority, and provide a few tips how to deal with legal reference questions and really pro se patrons. And so what we want to do is talk about answering the legal reference question at first. And I think the first thing we ought to be clear about is what exactly is the goal of legal research. Well, it's really this. It's really simple. It's to find all of the binding primary authority that is relevant to a particular legal problem being researched. So now I'll talk a little bit about what binding authority is and what primary authority is in the next few minutes. But the key point is that what we want to do is direct our patron to all of those resources that will allow them to find the relevant authority that answers the legal problem that they're actually having. So that brings us to what is legal reference and the goals of a legal reference interview. And I think there are two. It is helping that patron to find all of the primary authority or resources leading to primary authority. And it's also to avoid giving legal advice. So that's a little bit of the dance that we engage in, which is to help them find something without substituting our judgment for their judgment. All right. So what are the steps in the legal reference interview? The steps are somewhat akin to what I teach law students to do when they engage in an analysis of a legal problem, or a lawyer might engage in when they engage in analysis of a legal problem. How do they go about figuring out what to do? So I think the first step, though, is to determine what the patron is asking for. And this is not dissimilar from what you all do when you conduct a reference interview for whatever problem you have, right? We engage in query negotiation, and they ask a question, and they ask this question, but they really mean something else. We go back and forth, and we finally figure it all out. Well, there's a little bit of that, too, with doing a legal reference interview. But what we'd like to do is come away from that discussion with identifying a general subject area of the problem. Are they asking about a problem with landlord and tenant? Is it a problem that is it domestic relations? Maybe it's a divorce or a child custody issue. It might be a property dispute. Sometimes we'll get questions about homeowners associations and whether the homeowner association do X, Y, and Z. But we want to identify a general subject area, and that'll help us direct them to the right range of resources. The second thing, well, let me pause at this moment, talk just a minute about dealing with pro se patrons. So I know you all have super busy reference desks in law libraries and libraries. And I think what I do when I'm dealing with pro se patrons is I tend to listen carefully and very empathetically. I think what we should be aware of is that a patron with a legal problem might be under particular stress because they might be facing a loss of property or a loss of status in the case of perhaps a divorce, or their children are going to be taken away through a custody dispute. There is also an aspect of these problems where a patron really wants to vindicate the rights. They want to prove that they're right, or they want to win a case. So they may be particularly difficult to deal with. So what I do for my interview methods is some tips is sometimes I just let them vent a little bit, right? I let them go on and talk about their problem, and I sit and I listen patiently. I think at some point there's maybe a therapeutic aspect of it that they just want to be heard. At some point, however, though, we have to redirect. And so what I try to do if the patron is going on for a long period of time or in a very public way that's troubling to other patrons is eventually bring them to a book or an index, or ask for a very specific thing I can do for them. And I might even hand them an index to a book of some kind and say, how about you start your research here, and get them to sit down and focus on that. Okay, let me go back to our steps though. The next step then is determine the jurisdiction. So we have the subject matter, then we have to determine the jurisdiction. So we are there are federal jurisdictions and the state jurisdiction. Colorado is a state jurisdiction, but remember there are 49 other states. So each of those is a jurisdiction, and then there's local government, whether it's the city or the county government, and there are other forms of local government as well. So part of what we have to do is not identify just the subject matter, but where the matter takes place, which set of laws might apply. So jurisdiction is step 2. Then we'll want to develop a list of keywords. This will help them search the index, or if you bring them to an online tool, to search the online tool, even quite frankly, Google, right? And the keywords would be something about, it might be keywords about the subject matter, the jurisdiction, and maybe happily they've even brought you a citation to a statute or a case. That would be fantastic. That can always be a good starting point. And then the question is how to navigate them to the relevant authority. So this is maybe a little different from what we typically do for non-reference questions. What we're really trying to do is not so much direct them to a specific answer or a specific authority or a specific statute, unless of course they ask for one specifically that we can point out. We want to help them engage in the process of legal research, the process of thinking through what exactly is their legal issue and which authority actually applies, and allow them to use their judgment to do that. Because what we want to avoid is the what's called the unauthorized practice of law. And this is where we would be acting as if we were attorneys. So clearly to practice law in the state of Colorado, you need to have a license from the Colorado Bar and be an attorney to do it. And then you're allowed to engage in advice and client advice and so on and so forth. I think realistically it would be unlikely we'd ever be sued for giving advice. I'm not sure entirely that any patron would expect that coming into a public library and asking for help would constitute a client-attorney relationship. Nonetheless, I have run into patrons who are litigious, right? They certainly want to litigate everywhere and look for reasons that someone else is responsible for their problems and not themselves. So we just want to be careful. That's just not an area we want to go into. Even if it's not actionable, our advice might be bad advice, and we wouldn't want to do that. So legal problems can be quite complicated, and there can be nuances and information that the patron just isn't telling us, and that may lead us to make a bad decision. The other day, I had a patron come into our library, a middle-aged woman. She was, at least initially, she was in the process of getting a divorce, and her attorney who was representing her had dropped her, according to her, about 2 weeks before the trial. And so she was at a loss, and the attorney also had filed a lien against her property to recover the attorney's fees. So I'm thinking, okay, this sounds like it's recently happened, and so I begin to engage in an analysis and what resources we can find. Is it a statutory problem? Is this a breach of contract problem? Is this a matter that would be brought to the Colorado bar as a function of poor representation by the attorney? So I begin to step her in through that analysis. In the process of doing that and finding some resources we have in our library, she proceeds to tell me that the divorce actually was completed in 1996. So this is now a nearly 20-year-old claim that had been filed against her property, and she wants to sell the house, and there's $20,000 lien against the property, and she wants it removed. Well, that's a very different kind of a problem than if it's an ongoing action that has to be or can be brought before the judge and dealt with in a proceeding. So this is something that we want to be careful of when we give advice and direct people to resources. So the question is then, what can and can we not do as librarians? So looking at this table then, really what we can do is we can direct patrons to court forms. If they ask for a particular form, we can bring them to a court form. What we can't do is fill the form out for them or recommend specific legal forms where they haven't asked for the specific legal form, because the selecting of the form itself is using judgment that we want them to use, we don't want us to use, even the completing of the form. Certainly there are aspects of forms that are very straightforward, name and address and all the rest, but we don't want to engage in that. We can certainly recommend resources, and we can help them locate statutes, cases, regulations, if they, in court rules, if they bring it to us with a citation, right? So we can look up and find, CRS Title 18 of the Revised Statutes or a particular case, that's fine. What we really ought not to do, though, is provide the patron to a particular law without their providing a citation to it, right? We shouldn't say, oh, well, this case solves this problem or this statute solves this problem. We shouldn't do that. We need to let them figure that out. We can read a statute or a case or a rule to a patron, but we can't interpret that rule or that case or that statute. So sometimes we get a phone call and the patron asks us to read a statute. Well, we can do that. We can't put a gloss on it though that says, oh, well, this means X, Y, and Z. So we want to avoid that. We can certainly help generate search terms, and we can run online searches. We can help search the index or table of contents. Those are all things that we do as librarians, and that's part of our our pedagogical function as librarians. That's absolutely great. Of course, we don't want to offer advice on the legal outcome of any particular problem, even if we think we know what the correct outcome would be. We want to avoid doing that. So again, the goal is to bring the patron through the resources and allow them to use their judgment to interpret the authority, right? And what they want is authority, and really what they want is primary binding authority. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? There are two broad categories of authority, and this is something every law student who comes to law school, this is typically what they'll be taught in their first week of law school. Even before their first week in orientation, they'll be taught this. So the two categories, there's primary and secondary authority, and then there is also binding and persuasive authority. So what's primary authority? Well, this ties back in to the legal system we have in this country. So we have, as you know, three branches of government. There's a legislative branch, there's an executive branch, and there's a judicial branch. And the legislative branch is the United States Congress, or in Colorado, the Colorado General Assembly. The executive branch is the the president at the federal level or the governor at the state level, and all of those agencies that report to the president, like the EPA or the SEC or the IRS, or in Colorado, the Department of Revenue, all administrative agencies. Of course, the judicial branch is the court system, right? Both the trial courts and the appellate courts, it's the entire court system. Each of those three branches of government produces law. The legislative branch produces statutes, statutory law. The executive branch produces regulations, or more accurately, the agencies issue regulations, and these regulations implement statutes. They produce other kinds of law, executive orders comes to mind, but for our purposes, we want to look at finding regulation. That's more typically what people do for research. And the judicial branch, of course, issues cases. I think that's probably maybe the most familiar kind of law we think about, case law. But I want to alert you that the judicial branch in this state also issues court rules. So these would be the rules of civil procedure or appellate procedure or evidence or small claims courts. They issue those rules, although interestingly, you find those in the Colorado Revised Statutes. So, okay. Those four forms of a law, plus the Constitution, both the articles, the amendments, and local government resources, local government ordinances, together constitute primary authority. So that's the law. If we're searching for the law, that's the law we're looking for. And it's primary, again, because it's issued from a branch of government and they have the authority to do this, right? But the picture's a little bit more complicated than this. Because while there are three branches of government, we actually have multiple governments in our country, right? There's the state government, of course, we're residents of the state of Colorado, but then there's the federal government, and the federal government has a legislative, judicial, and executive branch. So, and then of course there are 49 other states, and each of those has the same structure, and then there's a whole bunch of local governments. So this is why it's important to identify the jurisdiction, because what we really want is that primary authority from the proper jurisdiction. So, and that combination is what's called binding primary authority when it's brought into the appropriate jurisdiction. So, patron comes to you, they have a landlord-tenant dispute, they find and it's located in Golden, Colorado, right? That's where they're residents. They bring you a statute from Kansas or a case from Utah. It's directly on point. It's beautiful. It's from the court system or from the legislature, and it doesn't apply here because it doesn't. The Colorado courts aren't going to recognize that. We need Colorado law for that kind of a problem. Or you might have a nuisance claim, right? And typically that's a local government issue. We need to know what the ordinance is for the local government in which it arose, and not any other. So those are some of the issues that we have to navigate. So how do we find the primary binding proper primary authority? Law, as you might imagine, some of it's very hard to interpret. Of course, lawyers spend a career on this, and even lawyers with experience will find some of the laws hard to understand and interpret, and there are nuances to the law. Well, that's the value of the other kind of authority, secondary authority. So what secondary authority does is it helps us understand the primary authority, and importantly, it provides us with citations to the primary authority. So those are the two functions. It helps us understand primary authority, it explains it, provides commentary about it, and helps us find it. So secondary authority is written by, well, lawyers, and law faculty, and judges, and practitioners, even occasionally law librarians, right? It is very helpful because this is like consulting an expert in that area of law. It's like coming to the law school and talking to one of the law professors about how this area of law works, or it's like going to a law firm and talking to a practitioner about how this area of law works. So this is a great resource to get to. And it should be, I want to remind you that a secondary authority is always persuasive. It never binds a court, it's only persuasive, and that's the final kind of authority is persuasive. Okay. So what are some examples of secondary authority? Well, any book explaining the law. These can be, single volume, what we call single volume treatises, horn books, practice guides, a law journal article, a law review article. It's also a form of secondary authority. Legal encyclopedia articles. There are very good legal encyclopedias. They're great places to start research. An annotated form is a form of secondary authority. And then there are two others that are a little bit more specific to inside the law profession, something called an American Law Report annotation, and then restatements of the law. And I won't spend any time talking about those. But those are the examples of secondary authority. And where do we find them? Well, NOLA Press Publications is a good form of secondary authority. Thomson Reuters, this is the West publishing empire. They create a series of nutshells on a whole bunch of different topics. Those are nice, brief introductions to an area of law. Law students typically will get a hold of those when they're learning something about evidence or criminal law. So it covers all the subjects you find in law school and then some. But they're great for anyone who needs to figure out sort of the parameters of an area of law. The Colorado Bar Association makes CLE publications. That's a form of secondary authority that can be very, very useful. Bradford Legal Publishing, they're a publisher down in Denver. They make loose leaf services on different topical areas. Then the Legal Encyclopedia to be American Jurisprudence Second. That's part of the West Empire. We can talk about that a little bit at the end. Corpus Juris Secundum is another legal encyclopedia. Hein Online is a great resource for journals. It's a subscription service, tends to be kind of expensive, but it's great. And then numerous other legal publications. Anytime you have a book explaining the law, that really falls into secondary authority. But it can be very expensive, so it's understandable that your libraries may not subscribe to them. So the question is, what's available for free? Well, there isn't a whole bunch out there. There are a few things, though. For legal encyclopedias, you have really 2.5 choices, if you will. So there's WEX, which is a legal encyclopedia from Cornell. Cornell puts together the Legal Information Institute, and they pull together primary law and this form of secondary authority. So that's one place you can look to figure out kind of what an area of law is about. Lexis puts together this Zimmerman's research guides, and a research guide too is a great way. If you're ever stuck, go to Google and search for research guides. Law schools, law libraries will create research guides to different areas of law. Georgetown is a particularly good source for that. And then, yeah, you can do Wikipedia. That's fine. We do Wikipedia too, although we probably wouldn't admit it too often. And that can be a good starting point. I think the internet is a good place sometimes to start, not a good place to finish, is what I tell law students. But there you go. A legal dictionary, there's one available at dictionary.law.com. Law journal articles, how would you find those? Without having access to Hein Online, go to Google Scholar. Google Scholar actually will come up a few times this morning. But they have basically digitized or provide access to digital collections of academic institutions, including Hein Online. Hein is a publishing company that digitized law journal articles from the inception of the journal, even way back in the 1800s, more or less through the current issue. And you can certainly find the article that way. You might, though, hit a paywall, and you need to, at that point, log in. But there is a law journal search engine where universities that have put their journal articles available online, you can search them this way. Then, of course, there's some general search engines. LexisWeb is interesting because what this is put together by the LexisNexis folks, but essentially they have a select universe of resources that they draw from that they have culled, right? They've determined are valuable and reliable resources. So this is where we want to use our information literacy skills to feel confident what we found is good information. This helps us get there. Of course, you can do Google and USA.gov, and the USA.gov searches federal, mainly federal, but also state websites. And sometimes an agency will put on their website a very good guide on how to understand an area of law and how to proceed through that area of law. All right, so the takeaway is given this range of authority is that for the legal researcher, secondary authority is often the best place to start. Certainly, if a patron brings in a statutory citation, you might look it up in the statutes. But if they're just not sure, you might want to start with the secondary authority, and this will lead us back to the primary authority. So this is a pathway, right? What's a legal reference pathway? Well, determine that subject area, try to identify the jurisdiction, develop a list of keywords, or have your patron develop that list of keywords so they're thinking broadly about the problem, they're thinking about related terms, and so forth. See if you can bring them to a secondary authority, and then get them back to the primary authority, but let them think about what resource they need, really what their legal issue is, and let them interpret the law that they find. And then we're available to help. We'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of today's program. So I've got a minute. If there are any question, I can answer that. Okay, what I will do then is Karina from the University of Denver Law Library is here. I'm going to turn the presentation over to her at this point. Thank you.
Put my mouse in. Hi, my name's Karina Kondra. I'm at the University of Denver Law School. I'm primarily a international and foreign law researcher, but I do teach classes in domestic U.S. law, although I prefer the international foreign law. So what we're going to talk about today, or at least what I'm talking about, is statutory law and the legislative branch. So where do statutes come from? Now, when we talk about statutes, we talk about those laws that are passed by the legislature, the Senate, and the Congress, which in Colorado, and then are signed or vetoed by the executive branch, by the governor. So you've got two branches that are involved with the promulgation of statutes in Colorado. And we're going to be talking primarily about what happens in the legislature in Colorado for statutes. In Colorado, statutes are called the Colorado Revised Statutes. The official version is the Colorado Revised Statutes Annotated, which is published by Lexis. Those are the red volumes. They're printed every single year. Does anybody have a set of these in their library? Yeah. So these are your primary sources of law, statutory law. This is your starting place for research if you have a legal question that involves a statute. And most legal questions do involve a statute unless it's common law, which is completely case law. So there's two types of law: statutory law, case law, judge-made law, and we'll be talking about case law later. But when you're doing research, legal research, and there's a statute involved, you always want to start with the statute because that's the primary source of the law. There is an unofficial version. Probably most of your libraries don't have it. It's multi-volume. It's published by West. It's called West Colorado Revised Statutes. They're blue volumes. So you can direct your patrons to either one. It's just that the Lexis one's considered the official version. Now, the revised statutes are organized by topic. Each topic is assigned a title number. So Title I is elections, Title II is legislature, and it goes through to Title 43. Most statutes are organized this way. It doesn't really matter where you're at in the United States, except Louisiana, because we're not in common law. I used to practice in Louisiana. We're civil law, so it's a completely different system. But it's general codification of the laws. What does codification mean? Arrangement by topic. So when a law gets passed, it gets placed into its title or topic area within the Colorado Revised Statutes. So if a patron comes to you, typically hopefully they'll have a citation to a revised statute section. A citation typically will have the abbreviation either CRS. Sometimes you see it as COLO Rev Stat. It really depends on what you're looking at or what the patron has brought to you. So if you're reading a law review article and you see this type of format, it's a citation to the Colorado Revised Statutes. The first number is the title number. The second number is the article number, and we'll see that in a second. And the last number is the specific section. So when you look at this in the books, you go to Title 12 volume. Some of the volumes have multiple titles in it, but Title 12 has its own volume. The statute, when you actually go to the actual statute, the very first page of the statute, you get the article number 43.4, and then it'll tell you what the title is of that particular statute. So this is the Colorado Retail Marijuana Code. And then section 501 of that citation has to deal with fees. The reason why I'm showing you the table of contents is to show you that statutes are never one section. It's very rare that it's just section 501. You want to direct the patron to the table of contents for the whole Colorado Retail Marijuana Code, because there may be multiple sections on fees. They may have to look at the license type to determine the fees. So really, you need to know that this particular statute goes from 101 all the way to 1101. So look at the very beginning of the code, and then you can go to section 501. So when you actually flip to the specific section, you get the text of the statute. And then, so you can see this is very a short 3 sections of 501 section. And then at the end of the section, you get the bill source. And we're going to talk about why this is important in a minute when we talk about finding legislative history. So this is what the actual section 501 of the Marijuana Retail Code states. Now, this is the Colorado Revised Statutes annotated. What does annotations mean? Annotations, and this is, you want to use the annotated codes, and there's unannotated codes out there. Annotations are references to secondary materials as well as cases that have interpreted that particular section on fees. So if you have a patron that comes to you and is looking for cases based on a statutory section, if you have the Colorado Revised Statutes annotated, then you can actually go to that section, and if there has been cases passed, just look at the annotations, and they'll give you a short 1-paragraph summary of the case as well as the citation to the case. And then the patron can look that case up. There also are annotations to law review articles. So if they need some analysis of that section or that statute, then they can read the article that will provide analysis for that. And there's multiple articles listed there. So really, annotated codes, and we're lucky Colorado's primary version is an annotated code, because not all of them are. They're the most helpful way of doing research. So if you have a patron that comes in and asks for cases related to a statute, and you don't have the annotated code, I'm going to show you some places where you can send them. You'll probably have to send them. And they'll have to visit a couple of libraries. So where can you access the current CRS online? Most of you have probably seen this. There is a free version from Lexis of the Colorado Revised Statutes. You're limited to browsing or full text search. If you're using the print volumes, there's an index. You can look up your terms in the index, and it will direct you to the correct section. Indexes are by far the very best way of finding statutory provisions. However, if you're using the free version online, there is no index. So you're limited to full text searching and browsing. It includes the US Constitution, the Colorado Constitution, Colorado court rules, and the Advanced Legislative Service. Other places where you can access this, access the CRS online, LexisNexis Academic. If patrons come into our library at DU, we can sit them down at one of our computers. They'll have access to LexisNexis Academic. We also offer public terminals for Westlaw Next, which has the annotated version of the statutes. So if you hit a hurdle, a wall at your particular institution with how much you can help the patron, you can always send them to DU, because we have these resources for the public. I'm going to show you what the revised statutes look at like online real quick. They're working. And you always have to agree. But basically, your Colorado Revised Statutes is the third volume. You also, if they're looking for procedural court rules, they have the court rules here, which are included into the volumes of the print version. They've separated it out here, and the Constitution. So if we go into the Colorado Revised Statutes, the reason why I wanted to show you this, yes?
Are we supposed to be seeing this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Seeing the.
Oh.
Yeah, you have to kind of drag it over to that share screen.
Oh, did it not?
And then the folks out in Colorado.
Where's that?
Yeah, if you can find the browser.
There we go. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. No. Desktop. There we go. Hopefully. Oh.
Yeah, let me see if I can. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize this
See if I
was
can do it right. Yeah.
such a.
Yeah, it's all the technologies.
Oh, you just drag it on.
That'd probably be the way to do it.
There we go. So if we're using this, then can I actually use this? I'm sorry, I can't see it, so I can't actually. Okay, maybe we can't do this because I can't navigate the screen now.
Yeah,
It's a setup. I'll just kind of point then. you can put in search terms here, and they do use terms and connectors, so you can use Boolean searching. I highly suggest using Boolean searching because statutes aren't written in any type of normalized language, natural language. So if I were looking for marijuana retail code, and I didn't know what the code was called, I would probably do marijuana and retail, or marijuana within the same sentence as retail. So within the same sentence /s. The other way of doing it, and the way I prefer to look at them, is if I have a citation to the statute, I browse. Because then that opens up all the different codes, then it shows me how it's organized and all the different sections and what articles and sections are in. And typically that allows me to show the patron that there are more than one section within a statute, and you may just want to look at that. Now, if you also have a citation to the statute, you can put that citation into the box, CRS, the number, and it'll come right up. So just know that. Yeah. There you go.
Okay, let me do another thing here. Okay. Oh, sorry. We'll figure this out in just a second. And are you getting it, Margie?
No.
Nothing. Okay. We're going to stop the share for just a second. Share a screen, desktop 2, share that. Good. Got it. Okay. And remember to stand right here.
Okay. Can I see the PowerPoint myself? Because all I'm looking at right now is myself talking.
That's like the presenter's nightmare. Last thing I'm doing is see yourselves.
Okay.
That's better.
All right. So that's all the places where you can access the CRS Online. If a patron comes to you to ask how to access historical statutes, know in print that DU and I believe CU have all the historical versions in print, so they can see and come look at the succeeded volumes of the statutes. We also at DU provide access to Hein Online State Statutes archive, which goes back to 1868, and they're all scanned in digitally, so we can sit them down on a computer and they can do searches, although I usually show them the print because it's easier to flip through than Hein Online. So now let's talk about legislative materials. What we saw were the final versions of a bill that got passed, signed by the government, by the governor, and then published in the Colorado Revised Statutes. But there's this whole process that produces documents. We call it legislative history research. It's the bane of our researching projects, I want to say. I cringe when students come to me and say they have to do a legislative history project because they're extremely difficult. And we're going to see why. So we're going to focus now on the legislature and what happens in the legislature. Now, some of you might have seen this image. They have posted it on all the Colorado government websites. It's the process of how a bill becomes Colorado law. And it's assuming that it starts in the House, it goes through this process in the House, then gets passed to the Senate, then it can either get approved, It goes back to the House. If it gets approved, if there's a referendum, they have to go to the public, and then the governor signs. It's a very complicated process. But what I want you to know is that there are documents that come out of this process. And a lot of times patrons will want to see those documents. So sometimes we have patrons coming that they want to see the versions of the bill. They might want to see what the committee hearings said about the bill as it was going through. There are also committee reports at the different stages regarding the bills and the different versions of the bills. And then there's also floor debates. So these are all the documents that if somebody comes to you and asks, I need to do a legislative history on this statute, I need to find all the documents that relate to these statutes, then you're going to be looking at floor debates, committee reports, the different versions of the bills, and the debates. So what to tell a patron if he asks for statute history? Caution them that it's very difficult research. One statute may have been amended multiple times. So if there are multiple amendments, then they have to go do the legislative history on every single one of those bills. It's difficult, depending on the date of the statute, to find these materials. It really depends on the date, where they're going to be going, and they may have to visit multiple libraries. They may have to go to the state legislature library. They may have to go to the Colorado Supreme Court library. It really depends. If you came to our library, did legislative history research on a relatively older bill, we couldn't provide all the materials. We'd have to send them to other libraries. So what information can you help them find? Well, if you have the either online CRS or the print versions of the CRS, the bill number, the primary information that they need is the bill number. And if you go to the statutory section that they're looking at, the source will tell you what bill it was added by. It'll give you the chapter and the page number. So if they look this up, they can actually find it, and they tell you what section, when it was added. So this entire section was added in 2013. So they would look at the 2013 bills. So once they have that information, then where to direct them? We have at DU a really detailed how to do legislative history research LibGuide. It goes step by step into the process of how to find this information. The Colorado Legislative Council also has a guide. I definitely would show them the guide and then kind of go through the steps that they need to follow. That way, they'll get an idea of how hard this is to do and that they may have to go to different places. And our guide lists exactly where to go, the contact information, and the dates that you need to go to the libraries for. Where to find legislative documents? The Colorado General Assembly has all the legislative history documents from 1997 to 2015. We're very lucky that they put these documents online. It's in a really nice spreadsheet. You just find your bill by date, go to the bill, and it has all the documents, the committee reports, the fiscal reports, the voting records, everything that you need. The only thing that really isn't included are the recordings of the debates, but that can be found someplace else. There's also the Colorado Joint Legislative Library has resources, and these websites tend to refer back to each other. So there's links. You can go to one, and if you're looking for the session laws, it'll link you back to the website that actually has that. So it doesn't really matter where you start, although I always typically will go to the General Assembly website. Session laws, that's available on the Office of Legal Services. You can get those from 1993 to 2015 online. CU's library has digitized some of the old session laws from 1861 to 1909, which are online. And then if you come into DU's law library, you can use Hein Online's session law library, which goes from 1859 to 2014. So they are available, scanned in online. It's just how to access them and where to access them. Bill tracking. A lot of times we'll have patrons come in and ask how to do bill tracking, or they want to find a current bill in the current session. The Colorado Advanced Legislative Service, which is part of the free Colorado Revised Statutes online, that same website, you can go in, search for the bills by topic, and they will come out. There's also 2 new free resources for doing legislative tracking, both on a federal and state level. These websites, BillTrack 50 is a local Colorado company. They're providing free access to tracking all 50 states' current legislative history, legislative information. You just have to sign up for a free account, and you can go in, search, do across the country, search within Colorado, and set up alerts. So if something comes about, the patron can get an alert to the new materials. And then govtrack.us states, it's in the beta version, but they're adding a way to search current bills in the Senate. For more information about how to do statutory research and legislative history research, DU research guides. If you go to our homepage, and then there's 2 links at DU Law Library's homepage for research guides. You can click either one, and we have over 100 research guides there. So we have one on Colorado legislative history research, one on Colorado statutes, that goes in detail on how to do this research. They're very helpful. And then also CU research guides as well have a legislative history and statute research guides. So really a lot of times when patrons come to me, public patrons come to me, even when law students come to me and they ask how to do this research, I show them the research guides first, and then I kind of explain the process of it. I try not to tell them what statute to look at, because honestly, that's practicing law. I show them how to use an index, and I caution them if they're doing searching that it may not be just one statute that applies to their situation. A lot of times they just want one statutory section. It doesn't work like that. There might be multiple statutory sections that they need to look at. So really when I help students or public patrons do this, I show them the process and then send them off and allow them to do it themselves so I don't get in trouble. Do I have any questions about this? Just remember, annotated codes are your friend because they'll lead you to cases. And the red version is the red volumes are annotated. So if you have those. Now the version that's online for free is not annotated. I didn't mention that. So you can't find cases. They can just find the statute, the actual text of the statute. So just note that. All right, I think next up is case law by Scott Uhl.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, just because it's a project that I've been working on a lot over the last year and a half, here at CU, we've digitized the session laws sort of up to the point when the General Assembly has started publishing them. The session laws are sort of the version of the bill that was actually passed, that first version before it's incorporated into the Colorado Revised Statutes. We're still in the process of attaching metadata to a lot of those. The early ones are available online, but we have all of them in PDF format, so if you need something, you can send us an email. So yeah, just tooting my own horn a little bit there. But my topic for today is going to be the Colorado courts. I'm going to talk about a few things here. First, I'm going to talk about sort of the structure of the judicial system to give you sort of a broad overview and how that is going to play into sort of the different sort of research questions that your patrons might have. Then I'm going to talk about court rules and what those are, what they're for, where you can find them. And then case law, which is probably what you think of more when you think about doing research related to the courts. And finally, just a little bit of sort of advice and my thoughts about when it's a good idea to refer your patrons to us or to one of the other law libraries in Colorado. So first, I'm going to call back a little bit to Robert's slide in the first section and talk about sort of where this fits in. As Robert said, there's sort of these two parallel systems going on, the federal and the state system. And that's definitely true of the judiciary as well. There's a federal judiciary and a state judiciary, and they sort of run side by side with a little bit of interesting bleed over. But they are separate systems. This is sort of a diagram of how that works. In general, things move from like cases and issues that the courts are dealing with move from the bottom end of the chart to the top end of the chart. Where you start depends mostly on what kind of legal issues you're dealing with and where you're located. So if you're dealing with Colorado statute laws, if you've broken a Denver statute, then you're going to start in the state court system. If you've broken a federal law, if you've evaded taxes or something like that, you're going to start in the federal system. So you can get a gist of what sort of issues you're dealing with just by sort of knowing, well, my patron is dealing with federal taxes, so it's probably going to be a federal issue, or my patron is dealing with Colorado taxes, it's going to be in Colorado. If it's something about federal environmental statutes, federal system. So you can get an idea of what system you're probably going to be dealing with that way. I think the best advice, though, is secondary sources are your friend here to figure out the jurisdiction. Often it's not clear to us initially when a patron comes in what court they're going to be actually interested in, and secondary sources can often guide you into figuring out what sort of law is going to be applicable. So things generally move up in this case. They can also move across, though. You might have a situation where a patron has come in and they've been arrested for burglarizing a house, and that's going to be a violation of a Colorado law. But they have an issue where they think something that the police did in arresting them violated the federal constitution. So you've got this state law issue that's sort of the basic thing, but you've also got this federal law issue of did they violate the Bill of Rights in doing it. It's still generally going to start in the state law side of things, but the state courts can implement federal law in those circumstances a little bit. So this is where it gets complicated, and I don't expect you necessarily to grasp all of this. This is something that our first-year law students often spend a semester or two trying to sort out. But I just want to sort of impress on you that this is a complicated thing, and it's important. It really matters a lot in terms of which cases are going to matter to your patron and which aren't. And in general, how this will work is if you have two issues, it'll go up through the state system, and the state courts are going to care about what their state court bosses say about the state law issues, but they're going to care about what the U.S. Supreme Court says about the Bill of Rights issues. Does that make sense? So in general, you care about what your boss says. You don't really care about what your subordinates say. So if you're talking about a state law issue, the law of the land is what the Colorado Supreme Court says. But if you're dealing with a federal law issue, it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's this sort of trajectory from the bottom right to the top left if you've got those mixed issues. The other thing about this chart that is also a little bit oversimplified is the things in the bottom that are in blue sort of represent the trial court. That's the first court to hear an issue. And they're also the bottom rung of the ladder. They're nobody's boss. So we don't care as much about the rules that they set forward. We care more about what the appellate courts say. Those are the things that are going to be binding on the lower courts. And those are the things that we do most of our research on. And kind of for that reason, those blue courts are a lot harder to find case law on. They don't publish their opinions because they don't bind anyone below them. So it's harder to find that stuff, and it usually involves contacting the court or something like that. It can vary a little bit depending on who you're talking to, but in general, there's that sort of division too between things that are easy to find and things that are hard to find. I guess the last thing I'll mention is that you can see here that there are a few special courts in the Colorado legal system. Denver has its own special probate court. Probate is sort of dealing with what happens to someone's property when they die. So they handle wills and trusts and things like that. And if you're in the Denver area, there's a court that is specifically for that. So if you have someone coming in with those sorts of issues, that might be a red flag that that's sort of the court that you're going to care about. There's also a specific juvenile court in Denver, which obviously that deals with underage issues, primarily criminal. And then there's a special water rights court because we have so many water rights issues and that gets so complicated. There's a court that sort of has expertise in that. Yes?
When you say Denver courts, does that only apply if you're a citizen and the crime or whatever happens in Denver, or is it the Denver metro area?
It is, I believe the court has jurisdiction over the metro area. I'm not sure exactly where the lines are. And I'll also say that the jurisdiction issues get complicated there too. I would just consider it sort of a fuzzy rule that those courts will have jurisdictions in those areas. Yeah.
My question is about the district trial courts. What jurisdiction does that cover? I mean, I know the county is, but
Yeah, so there'll be a map in a little bit. It's sort of just mapped out into sort of chunks of what part of the state these different districts have been assigned. And those are also sort of interesting because they are both trial courts and appellate courts, depending on the issue. So they can hear appeals from like municipal courts. It can jump up to the district courts. The rules for that are fuzzy too, and you kind of have to go to the rules to see how all that works. So again, this isn't a hard and fast, this is how these are the lines that are drawn between everything. It's just sort of to give you an idea of where everything is coming. In general, I would avoid saying to a patron, this is the court you care about. I would give them an idea that there are these different sorts of courts and then help them find the rules that would sort of answer their questions for them. Even getting into this sort of idea of jurisdiction selection is too close to practicing law for my comfort. But it is important to sort of know that this is out there so you can guide patrons in that direction. Yes?
You mentioned that the blue areas, isn't as easy to do research on it. Is that the same case for the water courts?
That's an interesting question. I haven't done a lot of research with the water courts. It is a trial court, but they have sort of that special role with that special issue. They may publish more of their cases. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you for that, but they might have more. Yeah, so that's the sort of the gist, and the takeaway from this is basically that there are these important jurisdictional lines that depend on where things happened and what laws are being applied, and you do want to point patrons in the direction of sort of figuring out what courts they care about and which courts they don't. So the next piece that is sort of tied into that is court rules. Court rules are sort of the rules for interacting with the court. They're the rules that the courts have set up that dictate sort of what evidence can be introduced, when you have to file things, what those deadlines are, what format they have to be in, and things like that. It's sort of the procedural part of interacting with a court. Court rules don't say you can't steal, but they do say that if you've been stolen from, you have to file your paperwork in this way. In general, the court rules are all set out by the Colorado Supreme Court, and they're available in the Colorado Revised Statutes. You can find them in print. There's a couple of volumes of the CRS that deal with court rules, and you can also find them online. I'll show you that in a second. There are different rules for different courts. In general, those special courts, the water court, the juvenile court, the probate court, they have their own sets of rules. There are special rules for traffic court, things like that. So if you have a patron with an issue where they're actually dealing with a court, this is probably going to be an important place to point them, since it's going to be the official rule for what they need to do as they interact with the court. And just like the statutes, court rules have annotations, which will point you to sort of other relevant rules or statutes, sort of case law that might be on point. So checking those annotations with the rules is also an important step. Finding the rules is pretty straightforward. If you do a web search for it, they're generally high ranked. Because they're put out by the Colorado Supreme Court, that's the top link. But if you go there, it's just going to link you back to that LexisNexis site that we saw in the last segment about statutory research. So if you are not logged into Google, it'll be about the 4th entry. I've been there a few times, so it puts it a little higher for me. So it's just kind of depend on your search history. But if you just search for Colorado court rules, you're looking for that LexisNexis link. And if you get there and you navigate in, you can see on, well, you might be able to see that, I know that this text is small, especially on the screen, but if on the left-hand side, you can navigate to Colorado and then Colorado court rules. And you'll have this same list that you saw in the last section for statutory law, because it really is just sort of part of the CRS as it's published by Lexis. And so those same sorts of rules apply for how you can interact with this. You can narrow it down by what section you care about. If you have a patron who is trying to fight off a bunch of parking tickets, you can go down to traffic court. I think that would be in traffic court, and search just within that. You can open up the tables and sort of get down into a more granular section. I also like actually opening it up and sort of looking through the table of contents view, because it makes it a lot easier to see sort of what's above and below it, which can often be really insightful. But you can use Boolean searching, natural language searching to get through this too. And this is generally where the rules that are published by the state Supreme Court are here. These are the big rules. There are also going to be local rules that we'll talk about. And you'll generally find those local rules in a court website. I'll jump down to that just for the sake of the transition. The big rules about deadlines and how things work, what's introduced, is set by the state Supreme Court. A specific court, a local district court, can say you have to use Times New Roman and 12-point font. It's going to be more of the nitty-gritty stuff, and it's going to be more about sort of the paperwork of it, what you can and can't do in the courtroom in front of that judge sort of thing. Some judges have their own sort of way of doing things, and so those local court rules, you're going to want to either check their website or you contact the office of the court specifically. Just like for the rules, you're only really going to go to the court websites if you have a patron who's interacting with that court. The information that's there is mostly practical and related to how you are going to interact. It's going to have contact information for communicating with the court, which is something you might do if you want to get more information about a trial court opinion that isn't published somewhere else, but you know it's there and you need it for some reason. You're probably going to have to actually contact one of the court's clerks. It's also going to have hours and locations and things like that you need for getting there, those local rules. It's going to have online payments. I wouldn't be surprised if some of your patrons have some things that they owe to the court, and a lot of courts nowadays allow you to do that online. You can just enter your credit card information into the court website and your sins are atoned. And then docket information. Dockets are the court's schedule, basically. It's the official schedule for what is going to happen in the courtroom on any given day. And so that's obviously going to be important to people who have issues in front of the court and want to see what the docket is, when they're supposed to be there, and that sort of thing. So for finding these, I'll just quickly mention, if you know the specific court, doing a web search will typically get you there. If you know that you're searching for, the U.S. Court of Appeals, the 10th Circuit, you can type that in and it'll be the top 1 or 2 results. If you don't know exactly, or you want to sort of browse there, you can go for the federal courts. uscourts.gov is the main website for the federal judiciary. And this has a court locator that will sort of narrow it down and let you see the websites for all of the different courts. In Colorado, it's courts.state.co.us. That's the main website for the Colorado judiciary. And that's also going to have sort of court finding tools. You'll see in the upper right, there's that map of districts. Those are those trial court districts that we were talking about earlier. And there, you can also browse by, if you know that it's one of the state appellate courts, or if you know that you're looking for the water court, you can browse there through this. This is that map a little bit more close up. Again, this is just right there on that website. You can click through to one of these districts from the map on the site, but it also just gives you sort of an idea of geographically how this stuff is broken down. And it follows sort of county lines, but it's really just trying to get an even population distribution whenever that was initially set up. And so this is how the district courts are broken down. So this is an example of what a court website looks in the state court. They vary a little bit depending on what level you're at and what that individual court has decided to put up. This specifically is for looking up docket information for the Boulder District Court. You can search by the name of the person involved, by the date. These are all going to be forward-looking, or at least the ones that I've seen have all been only forward-looking. You can't look at docket histories from this page, which is a little irritating sometimes. But if you have a patron who wants to look up their date, you can look it in by their name, or if they know the day but they don't know the courtroom, you can look it up by what's going on that day, things like that. You can also see on the left, judges and staff is going to have contact information. That's in the tab on the left underneath dockets. Information for jurors who want to know, like, I know I have to report to jury duty. What does that entail? Court websites are going to be helpful for all of that sort of information. Yeah, so that's sort of what you can find on court websites typically. The higher you go, the more likely that they'll have sort of the cases they're dealing with at this moment. But at the district level, not much of that is available on the website. So the next thing I want to talk about is case law. That's probably going to be the bulk of what you're going to be interested in. Case law is court law. It's the opinions that judges write when they're deciding an issue. And typically they're going to be, the reason you're going to care about case law is for one of two kinds of law. One is common law, which we sort of mentioned earlier. And that's law that's purely made by the court. So an example of this is the idea of common law trespass. This is a really, really old rule that judges in England came up with that basically said you can't just walk on other people's land and do damage. And we're going to have a rule that you can't do that, and we're going to give out damages, give out money, or punish people for doing that because it's unjust. It was just sort of the law of this is what's just and unjust. And we've sort of adopted a lot of those rules from English common law. A lot of those things have been turned into statutes now. Common law is less and less relevant, but there still are some things where it's just, this is the rule, this is what courts have said for a long time, and that's what it is. And to find those, you're probably going to use secondary sources first, but the actual primary source of that law is the courts. So case law is what you would cite to for anything like that. Much more common is going to be statutory interpretation. We rely on our courts to provide sort of consistent and understandable interpretations for our statutes, which are often vague or didn't deal with circumstances that came up later, and we sort of rely on courts to come up with a solution for that. And that's going to be the bulk of that. And the idea for both of these is that we have this idea of precedent in the court system. We have this idea that what a court has done before is binding on future courts, at least to some extent. We say that because we've done it before and we want to be consistent, there's this principle that it's not justice if it's whimsical. It has to be something that you can rely on and sort of research. So if you've done it before, you should do it again. And so we look back to past cases, and those are held to be binding on other courts, especially what higher courts have done with their sort of is binding on their subordinate courts. But again, it's within that same triangle. The Wyoming Supreme Court isn't binding on Colorado state courts in the same way that the Colorado Supreme Court is. It's that hierarchy of what did my boss say, that's what I have to do. So to find case law, you're typically always going to want to start with secondary sources. Case law takes the form of opinions, which are sort of often long descriptions of what happened and how the law applies to that circumstance. So they're usually kind of wordy. They often deal with several legal issues in the same opinion. They might not describe the thing that you're looking for in the same way from one opinion to the next. So starting with secondary sources really helps you both figure out what the jargon is for the issue of law you're looking at, and it also is going to point you to maybe the big cases in that area, which is really helpful. If you can say, this is the big Colorado State Supreme Court case that deals with, you know, search and seizure issues in this thing I'm doing, and this is the language that they used. If you don't have that, you're really sort of in the woods. There are a lot of opinions out there. They're very wordy, so you're going to get a lot of results, and it's going to be hard to read through them and figure out what's relevant and what isn't. So in addition to secondary sources, if you have a statute, and you can go into those annotations in the CRS, that's going to be really helpful too. If you have a statute, that's a much better place to start than just diving into case law. You can also search cases just using a statute citation, because courts will cite to the statute that they're interpreting. So yeah, definitely you almost never want to start in case law if you have a patron come up, unless they have a specific case that they want you to find. That would be the only example I can think of where you jump right into looking at cases. So for our purposes, in the public libraries, I think Google Scholar is going to be the best place to start your case law research. There are a few other free case law search tools available, like Justia and FindLaw. I think Scholar is probably your best option for a few reasons. Like those other two, it's free. It's going to be more familiar to your patrons. Your patrons are more likely to have used Google and to have sort of a sense of how Google searching works than they will for databases that are maybe trying to seem a little bit more like professional tools and might require a little bit more of, you know, the Boolean skills that we use and our patrons really don't. And it's legitimately a good place to start your research. It has pretty good coverage for state cases. For Colorado cases, it goes back to about 1950 for appellate cases and Supreme Court cases. And for the federal judiciary and for the Supreme Court in particular, the Supreme Court goes back to 1791 in Google Scholar. They've got pretty much everything. So it's pretty easy to pull things up. It's not going to be quite as current as some of our professional databases. It takes them a little longer to get cases in. And it doesn't have some of the really powerful tools we have for making sure that you're finding what's relevant and that what you found is still good law. But it's a very good place to start. And it's free and familiar. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this. I would assume that many or probably all of you have used Google Scholar for something in the past. This is the main page. To get into the case law, you just toggle over to the case law button and then start selecting your jurisdiction. The options they give you, Google knows where you live, so they're going to give you Colorado courts as one of your options and federal courts as one of your options. You're often going to want to be a little more granular than that. So for example, if you have that case where someone has broken a Colorado law, but there's the Supreme Court issue, you might be interested in both what the Supreme Court of the US has said and also what the Colorado appellate courts and Supreme Court have said. All of those things are going to be sort of things of interest to you. So you can just check off which courts you care about and which courts you don't if you go to that select courts link that's in the bottom of the page here. So if you select all of those, you can run a search. So the example search I'm going to use is imputed income child support. And I'm assuming that you've come up with the phrase imputed income because you've either gotten it from a patron who's come in and said, so the judge said something about imputed income and I want to fight him on it. What is this thing? Or you found it in a NOLO book, or it's in the statute on child support or something like that. So you've found this sort of legal jargon in your preliminary searching and you're using it in your case law search. If you just search for income child support, you get about 550 cases in the Colorado courts. If you use that word imputed, that jumps down to 61. So you're definitely filtering out a lot of stuff by using the correct jargon. And again, these take a long time to read through. So anything you can do to cut down on the irrelevant cases is going to be really important. So you can try this out and you'll see this. I'm not sure how easy it is for people to read this on the screen, but you can see that Google fuzzy searching is working. So it's finding impute, imputed, imputing, things like that. It's using sort of those natural language tools that Google uses, and all the other sort of Google operators, like using dashes to exclude terms or to link them as closely relevant, using quotes, things like that are all active in Google Scholar here. It's also going to give you information about citations, which is really important in case law. For one thing, it's a really good way to find other cases that talk about the same issues. So if you found a good case from maybe 1972 that talks about imputed income, you can look to cases that have cited that to find other cases that might be dealing with the same issues, and also to see what subsequent courts have done. You've got a little bit of post-search filtering options. You can look for only very recent things. You can sort by relevancy as Google determines it, or by date. And so that you have just a little bit of tweaking that you can do there. If you click on that first case, this is what the actual case law looks like in Google Scholar. At the top of the page, you have the citation. Cases are published in what are called reporters, which is just a book that it has every case that was published in order. And we have a bunch of those here in the library. DU has a bunch of those. The Supreme Court Library has a bunch of those. If you actually want to look these up in print for some reason, they're available in print in these reporters. And so the first number in the citation is the volume of the reporter. In this case, it's the 831st volume. The second chunk is the name of the reporter. This is the Pacific Reporter, and it's the second set of the Pacific Reporter. So that's actually the 1,831st volume of books in the Pacific Reporter. There's a lot of these. That just kind of gives you an idea of how much case law there is out there. And then the last thing up there is, or the last number after the reporter is the page number. So this is going to start on page 501, and then the year. So that's the citation information, and that's going to be the the identifier. That's going to be the actual citation that will link you to this specific case, even if there are cases with similar names. There are a lot of Smith v. Johnsons out there. So at the top, you're going to have the heading information for what the title of the case is. You're going to have the date. You're going to have who the judge was, and then the text of the opinion. The fuzzy numbers on the left correspond to those page numbers in the reporter. That helps you figure out exactly where it's going to be in the book. And as you can see, the terms you search for are highlighted, which is handy for scrolling through long opinions quickly and sort of seeing where imputed income shows up. Another important thing here, we talked a little bit about citations. So if you go up to the top left and click that How Cited button, it takes you to this page, which on the left, it's pulling out snippets that are right before the citation to your case, the case that we were looking at a second ago. So future courts have cited that case, and these are the sentences that they've used to cite to it. That gives you kind of a quick and dirty idea of what courts think is important about this case. On the right, you can see that cited by list, and it's going to have bars that correspond to how much the court talked about your case. So 3 bars means that they give it sort of some discussion. 1 bar means that they mention it in passing. That can be kind of helpful for knowing who's talking about the issue a lot, who's maybe just using it for a small point of law. You can look at all of those cases that Google has identified as citing it by clicking the link underneath. And really, this is a useful, quick and dirty tool, but to really know what the courts are saying, it involves a lot of clicking through and actually reading those future cases. But this is a really handy tool, and it is really handy to sort of know what future courts have done, especially since, if a higher court has overruled this case is no longer good law. So you might come up with the perfect case, but if the state Supreme Court has later said, no, that's not the rule, it's useless to you. And you have to go out and actually find that future case to see if that's true or not. Which sort of brings us to the last little section I'm going to talk about, which is when to refer patrons to us, to law libraries. The first thing I'll say is that sometimes this gets really complicated. For case law, you might have really niche issues, and it's hard without having sort of a legal background and some familiarity with how courts talk to figure out what sort of language to use to pull up relevant cases. And you can either, you can call us or DU or the state Supreme Court on our reference phone lines and ask for advice, but you can also just send patrons to us and we'll help them out. But yeah, sometimes if the question is getting more complicated than you can really get a hang on based on the secondary sources you cited, that's sort of what we're here for. The next thing, I'll say the next two things go together. Finishing case law research and updating cases are two concepts that sort of tie in together. Google Scholar is a great place to start. It's not a great place to finish, especially for legal research, because you have to find everything for legal research. You have to have done your due diligence and made sure that you found everything that's relevant, and you make sure that the things that you're citing to are still good law. And we have tools that are much better than the free ones that we make available to patrons to do that. So one of those things is we have access to cases that Google Scholar doesn't. We have access to really recent cases that have just come out and haven't made it into Google yet. We have cases that they haven't published, that courts have decided, we don't want to put it in that print reporter. We don't think this is a huge one. We're just going to let this one slide. Those still make it into our professional databases, and they're not as important as the ones that are published, but increasingly people do cite to those to courts, and they do play a little bit more of a role, and we have access to those, and there really aren't good free tools for accessing them. Updating cases is the process of making sure that your case is still good law, that it hasn't been overruled by one of the courts that is the boss of the court that you're citing to. And we have good tools for that too. The professional databases have teams of attorneys that go through all these cases and categorize them by sort of legal topic. There's sort of a controlled vocabulary of legal concepts that these professional databases have used, and they have armies of attorneys that apply these sort of controlled thesauri of concepts to make sure that all of the cases that deal with this issue are in this bucket, and this case has been overturned by this case, and it guides you through that whole process much more clearly than Scholar does. So for making sure that what you're handing into the court is still good, it's really important to do that last step and make sure that everything is right. And lastly, historical research. I said that for state courts, Google Scholar goes back to about 1950. That's pretty typical of the free databases. We, DU, the state Supreme Court Library, all have stuff that goes back further than that. So if people are interested in old case law, law libraries are really the place to go. So sort of on that note, these are sort of your options for referring patrons to places with a few more resources. If you're in the Denver area, DU and the Colorado Supreme Court Library are the two places that are really good to send patrons to. They both work with the public and have people who can help you out. If you're north of Denver, here at CU, we're sort of the thing that happens north of, in the northern half of Colorado. And down south, the Penrose Library isn't strictly speaking a law library, but it did absorb a law library at one point, and it still has a license to a public access terminal to one of these professional databases. So if you have a patron who's south of Denver and who needs to do this kind of research, they have people who can help with that sort of finishing step of making sure that everything is still good law. And that's helpful if you've got regional people down there. So to wrap up, the court structure is important because it sort of lets you know which cases are important, and you definitely want to point people in the direction of the binding material. Court rules and court websites are both really important for people who are actually interacting with the court. The rules tell you what you need to do. The court websites will give you information about where you're going, who you're contacting, things like that, what the docket information is. And for case law, Google Scholar is pretty much the name of the game in terms of free case law research. But for finishing it up or for the really tricky questions, the professional tools are pretty important, and we can help you out with that. So that's my time. Were there any questions at the end? All right, thank you very much.
Okay, at this point, let's take a 15-minute break, and we will reconvene at 9:45, and we'll see you folks on the webinar at 9:45. So thank you. Yeah.